I've been drawing on Rod's books, articles, and research outputs in the field of supervision for many years now, in my teaching and in my own supervision research. And in the last few years, I've had the privilege of being on an international interdisciplinary supervision conference committee with Rod, in which I have witnessed Rod's enduring commitment to the international development of supervision through research, training, and publications. Rod Goodyear is Emeritus Professor of Counseling Psychology at the University of Southern California and Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Redlands. The huge theme of Rod's scholarship has been supervision and training of counsellors and psychologists, and with Janine Bernard is co-author of Fundamentals of Clinical Supervision, which is now in its 6th edition. This is a text that I would strongly recommend to you. Rod was a member of the American Psychological Association's task group that developed the association's clinical supervision guidelines. He was the 2015 president of the Society for the Advancement of Psychotherapy and received both APA's 2015 award for distinguished lifetime contributions to education and training, and the Society for the Advancement of Psychotherapy's 2018 Distinguished Award for the International Advancement of Psychotherapy. So we're very privileged to have Rod with us today. Rod's presentation will focus on the concept of deliberate practice and will describe deliberate practice and its history, and then discuss what trainers and supervisors could learn from early trends in implementation. So Rod, I'd like to welcome you for your keynote speech. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Rita. And you left out the part where we were together on a cruise ship for a conference.
Well, don't say anything more about that now, Rod. We're on public forum here.
That was a wonderful conference. That's a wonderful conference. Well, welcome everyone. It's 6:30 in the morning here, and I'm not fully awake, but I will do my very best to sound lucid. Let me find my slides here. Let's see. So my hope today is that I can review where we are with deliberate practice and suggest some future directions for it. And as I do the presentation, I'm going to challenge some of your beliefs maybe about the field and where we're going and what's important. And as a matter of fact, I'll submit that if I haven't done at least some of that, I won't have done my job. So let me frame the argument here, and that is that I think we in the mental health professions tend to get excited about new things when they come about. I mean, to the extent where I kind of use the metaphor of a shiny new object. New interventions come along and people get very excited about them, and then gradually we become more objective about them and often just move on to other things. I think, and there's a certain rhythm to that. And I remember years ago hearing that when client-centered therapy was first introduced, it was much more effective than later, that it kind of lost some of its zing, if you will, over time. And I haven't been able to find that article, but I do know of one with CBT, which there's some evidence now that its effectiveness is dropping over time. I think, and probably a number of explanations for that sort of thing, including kind of the excitement and placebo effects of new interventions and excitement and so on. And I would submit that even though training is different than psychotherapy, there's a similarity maybe in the trajectory. And so in particular, my argument today is going to be that deliberate practice has been greeted with a lot of enthusiasm. I think in some ways it's the next shiny new thing that we're embracing. But at the same time, it's been around enough that I think we can begin to temper our expectations and maybe look at where it seems to be going and where it's going to have enduring impacts. So So the concept was first suggested by Scott Miller back in 2015, and then it took a while for the literature to start developing. And here's my approximation of the literature now. There's actually probably more books than there are articles yet, as you can see at the bottom of the screen. But at the same time, the literature is developing, and I think we do have that kind of trajectory developing. And so I think to get us started, I think it's useful to review what deliberate practice is, where the concept came from. And I should add that I'm going to be fairly academic for the first part of this presentation. I think some of you are probably very well versed in what deliberate practice is, and others of you are more at the being intrigued stage. So to make sure we're all on the same page, as it were, I want to do a fairly formal presentation of it and develop the arguments for how it is we got to where we are, and think about next steps then. So, so many of you are familiar with the origins, which really was in Erikson's work in 1993, him and his colleagues, and with a group at the Music Academy of West Berlin. And what they did was they had professors nominate the very best of their students, then nominate another group that were good students. Then they went to another department of students. These were all violinists, I'm sorry. And another department, which was training those who would be teaching violin. And then the fourth group was middle-aged professionals who were world-class performers. And the study was pretty straightforward in that what they looked at was the number of hours of practice that he came to label, Erikson did, deliberate practice, that they practice in their work. And by the time they were 20. So that's the graph here. You can see on the left side the number of hours of practice. And what they found was that the best predictor, in fact, the most robust predictor by far, was the amount of time that these individuals had devoted to individual practice, deliberate practice. That is, and deliberate practice, we're going to elaborate on later, is setting time aside outside of your performance time to practice individual skills. And as you can see from the graph here, teachers, those who were going to be teaching violin had put the least amount of hours in. Those who were the very best, both the best students and the world-class performers, had put in the most hours. So that was the first, that was really the origin of the concept. And Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book then, Outliers, which many of you no doubt read, in which he popularized this work and maybe unfortunately popularized also the notion of the so-called 10,000 hour rule, that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert in any field. Unfortunately, I think in popularizing it, he managed to confound a few things, and so he gave examples. For example, of the Beatles practicing for hours in Frankfurt, and similar kinds of things, which confounds the notion, because as I'm going to talk about it, it's not hours of practice in your field that's going to make you the expert. It's separate in deliberate practice that we'll talk about. So let me get this. So let me walk you through how the field began to embrace deliberate practice, that kind of the trajectory it's followed so far. And to do that, I'd like you to follow along with me here, and imagine we visited the distant planet of Hecate, which is named for the Greek goddess of magic. Its inhabitants are avid players of Arcarios, a game with few rules other than is played solitarily in 50-minute sets. Players keep score using whatever systems they choose. And although everyone discusses how they play our carios, it's unusual to be able to watch others play. Visitors to Hecate noticed that players often argue about how to keep score, how they know whether they're winning. Our carios players spend hours discussing the intricacies of the game. As they gain experience, they grow increasingly articulate describing their play. Our carios players get no better as they play more games by any criterion, although most indicate that they do. The average player estimates himself to be above the 80th percentile of all players in skill level, and some Hecatians are recognized as exceptionally good players. And so this is kind of a thinly disguised allegory for where we are in the field, and I want to unpack some of this then as we go. And in so doing, I need first to spend a little bit of time talking about how we think about expertise in our field. And so the weakest of those is reputation. So if you ask, and this is something we use all the time. So someone asks, who the best therapist is around, and some people come to mind almost immediately and so on. And yet we don't see them actually work. We rarely have data on how they're doing their work and so on. So that one is a fairly weak indicator of expertise. Experience, the amount of time in the field, and I think that's as I'm going to provide data on is actually not what people believe it is, that experience tends not to get people better. Cognitive processing. So, and it is clear there that experts process information more quickly. The data, the processing becomes more automatic and quick and so on. That doesn't correspond necessarily with outcomes. The last two are the ones we're going to spend more time on today. One is quality of performance or competence. The competence movement, at least here in the States, has become a very big deal, a lot of attention to competence. And I'm going to make the case that competence is really an aesthetic, that competence is defined usually by panels of experts in the field who agree on what's important and how it should look in practice. And that's important. It's actually essential in terms of our training and supervision. And I'll provide data to show you that unfortunately it doesn't link to client outcomes. I think it's essential as a prerequisite, absolutely essential, but more is needed. And then finally, the criterion that I want to argue for, and really that's how we get back to deliberate practice, is superior client outcomes. That real expertise should be defined in terms of therapist clients getting better, and that the therapists are getting better themselves over time. So with that framing, I want to talk about how I got into this. For years, I've been privileged to work with a group, we call ourselves the Otsego group. It's Terry Tracy, Bruce Wampold, Jim Lichtenberg, and myself. And it's been a really rich association, and we have tended to get together annually to socialize, but also to do work. And one of our products was this article we published in 2014 in the American Psychologist, in which we challenged the notion that you can really become expert in psychotherapy. And our reasoning had to do with the fact that, and I'm going to share some of that reasoning in the following slides, by the way, that the therapists don't get actual feedback on how they're doing. And so they develop their own notions of effectiveness, but it doesn't correspond well to what's happening. And so, and as you can imagine, that triggered some reactions. And so there were a number of follow-up articles as we responded to that in the field. But the hopeful note in that was that some therapists do get better, and the data, preliminary data suggests that deliberate practice may be one way to make that happen. And so that led to my next project, which was working with Tony Ruminaire, Scott Miller, and Bruce Wampold on an edited book, The Cycle of Excellence, in which we made a case for deliberate practice. And since then, Bruce and Tony and Scott have each gone on to do a lot of innovation with respect to deliberate practice, and I'll talk about some of their work. I've moved on, I haven't quite moved on to other things, isn't quite right, but I haven't invested the energy they have. So I feel like I know the area, but they're the ones doing the innovation. So let me march through the argument that got us to where we are, I think, with deliberate practice now. And so I'll just, I'm not going to read these to you, but in fact, we'll kind of unpack them as we go. So the first argument is that psychotherapy is very effective, but its overall effectiveness is not proved across time. So these two figures depict effect sizes, and we don't need to get into the statistic, have you remember your statistics courses, but just in brief, Cohen's D, which is one measure of impacts or effect size, is the difference between the mean of a control group and the mean of a treatment group. So as you can see on the left side, fluoxetine or Prozac, the effect size in treatment of depression is 2.6, at least in this one study. That is, the average untreated person is better. The average treated person is better off than 60% of the untreated person. So in Cohen's nomenclature, that's not a very big effect size, and yet that's something that certainly is used in treatment very widely. Psychotherapy, by contrast, has an effect size of 0.8, which Cohen would maintain is a very large effect size. So the good news is psychotherapy is more effective than most or many medical interventions, and the average treated person is better off than 80% of untreated persons. So that's the good news we have going into the argument I'm about to make. There are some indicators we set for improvement. For as many as 25% of clients drop out before improving, and even more sobering, between 8 and 10% of all clients deteriorate through treatment. So, and the thing that is sobering to some extent is that this seems not to have changed across time, that the effectiveness of psychotherapy is robust, but it's been that way. And so this is in contrast to a number of other areas in which there have been huge changes. So in the Olympic sports, for example, the mile run back in, things keep drifting across my screen, 1861, the fastest time for the mile for men was almost 5 minutes, and now it's 3 minutes and 41 minutes seconds is the most recent. Another example, women's javelin throw has changed dramatically, and that's true of virtually all Olympic sports. And there's just any number of other areas. Tuberculosis deaths have dropped. Life expectancy has grown in all regions of the world. Even IQ has grown steadily. So it's when you compare where we are with psychotherapy with these kinds of indicators, it is interesting. And the way the field has tried to deal with this has been to emulate medicine. That we develop, in medicine, there's always the quest for the new best treatment, and we've tried to emulate that. Without real success, by the way, and I know that may be offensive to some of you who embrace particular models, but the fact is, beginning with the work of Smith and Glass back in the 1970s, any number of meta-analyses have now shown that psychotherapies are all virtually equivalent in terms of their effectiveness. And we don't have time to unpack that. I would refer you to Bruce Wampold's book, The Great Psychotherapy Debate, if you really want to dig into that. But so we're left with the so-called Dodo bird hypothesis, which some of you might remember from Alice in Wonderland. There's a scene, if you will, in the book where the characters all take off in a race, but they start at different points and go in different directions. And finally, the dodo bird asks them to stop, and someone asks the dodo bird who won, and the dodo bird declares all have won and all shall have prizes, which Rosenzweig back in 1936 had declared is really the state of where we are with psychotherapy. So if our intent is to make psychotherapy more effective, it's probably not going to be at the level of some new treatment. There'll always be new treatments, and it's important, by the way, I think, to embrace the treatment and work from a particular model. But that's not going to make the field more effective. And so the argument, and what I'm doing here again is tracing the argument that got us to where we are with deliberate practice, is that it really needs to be improving the individual therapist, one therapist at a time. Okay, so the next part of the argument is that given that, it's important to note that therapists tend not to improve across time. Here's this was a study. Paul Clement was an individual practitioner who kept track of his work across 40 years and was surprised when he looked back over. He was just a very careful collector of data, went back and did some really careful work to track his effectiveness, and found, to his surprise, that he hadn't become more effective in terms of client outcomes across those 40 years. And I've highlighted in yellow the point that even though I perceive myself as getting increasingly knowledgeable and skillful, which I think is the important point. And my guess is those of you who are listening in are believing this about yourself. It's just that that's the belief that therapists have, and that's why when we published our article in the American Psychologist, people pushed back so hard because it really was counterintuitive. It flew in the face of what people believed they knew. Here's more compelling data. That was an individual's work. This is work with 170 therapists over 18 years with 6,500 clients. And so each line is a regression line for one therapist. And it shows, and the data in this case were from routine outcome monitoring. I think it was the OQ45. And they tracked whether each of those therapists was becoming more or less effective across time. Again, I'll point out that as you look across this dashed line, that's the 0.8 effect size. So we keep coming back to that. Again, as a group, they were very effective. But as you can see, there were different trajectories. And interestingly, Goldberg et al. Found that there was a slight trend for these therapists to become less effective over time, although a few did improve. And I think that, again, I keep coming back. I think I'd like to introduce the sobering data along with, I think, the hopeful data, which is that the people can improve. And I want to take a moment here to talk about competence versus expertise. I've already I alluded to that earlier. The competence is really an aesthetic. It's an established way that we should be performing so that people can rate our work, much like figure skating on the Olympics, for example. We know what looks aesthetically pleasing or aesthetically right, if you will, in psychotherapy. And I've got some studies here if anyone's interested, that show that competence, which is really important, still doesn't really link to client outcomes. And the other thing, and that's why I think this is an important part of this conference, is that what we know about supervision, and I'll allude to my own book in our review there, is that supervision is very good at developing supervisee competence in multiple domains. The data are still mixed on whether it actually improves client outcomes. The there are few studies in either direction. And I think, we can't yet claim victory on that front. And so I think that kind of underscores the importance of deliberate practice as a promising way of approaching this. So having established that most therapists don't improve, except for a few, there are some data that are more hopeful. So these are data from the Calgary in Canada Counseling Center, where they found that therapists' effectiveness gradually did increase slightly over time. And that was a function of how that organization was developed, that this was an organization that focused heavily on client outcomes. I'm going to make a case that embedded with the use of deliberate practice should be routinely getting data from your clients on their outcomes, whether with OQ45 or the PCOMs or any number of systems where the clients fill out ratings regularly of how well they're doing. So they did that in that center, and we've got a chapter in Cycle of Excellence that kind of is a case study of how the Calgary Counseling Center went about their work. It wasn't easy. A number of therapists quit when they were forced is strong, when it became an expectation in the agency that they would pay attention to their client outcome data. They brought in an external consultant who then worked with them. So as they found cases deteriorating, they would examine what might be happening and really focused on skill building and kind of a deliberate practice approach. So again, some early data then to suggest that it's possible to set up situations in which therapists do improve. And then the study that's kind of seminal in all this is Daryl Chow's work. It was based on his dissertation. And what they did in this study was to, again, using data from client outcome data, they identified they chunked the therapists in quartiles, and the highest quartile, the so-called super shrinks, they found that they engaged in deliberate practice twice as much as those in the second quartile, and about 4 times as much as those in the bottom quartile. So we're kind of back to the Erickson study initially that I talked about with the violinist, that it was really pretty directly related to the amount of deliberate practice. And there were questions about, this was retrospective, of course, and questions had to do with things about, the amount of time you go back and review your recordings of your sessions and focus on mistakes you made and ways you might improve and so on. So that's how that's really the argument that got us to where we are, I think, and now in terms of being intrigued with deliberate practice as a way to improve the field. And so let me review some of the concepts that are central to deliberate practice. And let me begin with the premise that I've had been exposed to all my life, beginning with my parents and any number of teachers, kind of the mantra that practice makes perfect. And I'm sure most of you have had that indoctrination as well. And here's something from our book. Roger Peterson told a joke about the New York City tourist who stopped a cabbie to ask, "How can I get to Carnegie Hall?" And the cabbie responded, "Practice, practice, practice." And then Roger noted that the cabbie didn't say read, read, read. So experiential learning really is about practice. But the issue is what we practice. And the fact is that what practice does is makes permanent, that things we practice over and over again become ingrained and automatic and permanent. If you're practicing effective things, then yes, you can move toward perfection. But otherwise maybe not. And so Erickson has introduced this distinction among types of practice. So naive practice is what most of us do when we're engaged in our day-to-day work as therapists or anything else that we're doing. And so, we do it over and over again. We believe we're getting better and so on. But we, without specific goals for challenging ourselves and getting the necessary feedback and getting better. The next level up, though, would be purposeful practice. This would be those, taking deliberate action to improve ourselves in specific domains, kind of pushing yourself out of your comfort zone and so on. And then the third of those is deliberate practice, which is much like purposeful practice, but involves having a coach or a supervisor to help you get there. So I'm going to walk through the kind of the components, if you will, of deliberate practice, and then I'm going to start suggesting ways that we can be deliberately practicing. I want to show a few videos, and hope we have time at the end maybe to have you discuss among yourselves the ways you can be using some of this. So the first part is isolating specific skills to improve. So key to deliberate practice is breaking an activity into discrete component parts and drilling on them. And so the original study was done on musicians. And of course, musicians have done this forever. This is how they develop skills. The same thing with athletes. So, we just had the Olympics a month or so ago, and there were lots of stories about individual athletes and how they'd spent years and years of their young lives practicing for hours and hours every day. So that's deliberate practice. And so deliberate practice in music and sports has been accepted for a very long time. And many of you have engaged in that as you have learned instruments or engaged in sporting activities. What's newer is doing it, of course, in the mental health domain. So I just got a quote here from John Wooden, who's a legendary coach here in Los Angeles at UCLA in basketball. It's kind of talking about how he worked, and really, I think it really captures the so-called whole part method. So I would show them the whole thing to begin with, then I'm going to break it down into the parts and work with them on things like dribbling and shooting at the baskets over and over again and so on, and then bring them back together. So that's the concept. And the other thing, while I'm thinking of it, is that as you break out these individual parts, it need not actually look like the activity you're building toward. And many of you remember the movie The Karate Kid, which I've actually got a video clip that we don't have time to get into here to illustrate that. If you remember the movie, this kid approaches the karate master and asks him to teach him karate. But the first step is the kid's asked to wash the car, and the kid's told to wash it a particular way and buff it. And then he's asked to sand the karate master's deck, and he's told to use a particular motion, and then to paint the house. And the kid gets increasingly irritated that he seems to be taken advantage of. But then the karate master takes those individual skills and shows him how to put it together in the practice of karate. So again, it's the point here is that it's about breaking out individual skills, teaching them, and bringing them together into a whole. And here's a quote from Erickson, excuse me. So you're playing doubles in tennis and you just miss a backhand volley. If the same situation emerges a couple hours later, you're not likely to do much better. But imagine practicing with a coach who stands at the net ready to offer you that background volley over and over, making it increasingly difficult. You can improve your performance more in those 1 or 2 hours with a coach than in 5 to 10 years of regular practice with your friends. And I think this speaks both to the next component of deliberate practice, which is having a coach or a supervisor, but it also speaks to, again, that notion of isolating a skill. So I know we've all had experiences where something's happened with a client where some kind of interaction occurred, and we think, oh my God, I really blew it. And boy, the next time that comes around, I know I'm going to do it better. But that next time may not come around for quite a while, that it's a situation like what just happened. And by the way, that's true often in our supervision, where our supervisees bring in a situation where you work with them to improve a response to a client that occurred, but then there's no predictability about when that opportunity to practice exactly that skill is going to come around again. So what deliberate practice is about is finding a way to break that out, and much like the coach who's practicing the one tennis action, to isolate it and practice it so that when it does come around again in practice, you're ready for it. And of course, then the distinction between types of practice between that really characterizes deliberate practice is that there is a coach or a supervisor, and all of us embrace that's so important for our development. Orlinsky and Ronestadt did an international study of psychotherapists across many countries, and one of their questions had to do with what was the most important factor in your contributing to professional development, and supervision emerged as the foremost factor. So, and that's intuitive. It's something we all believe, or we wouldn't be at this conference. So that part is really kind of a given, and we don't need to read this. It's just it's another thing from Erickson, again affirming the importance of a supervisor and getting us to where we intend to go. The next key component is getting effective feedback, and that was the point of our argument in the American Psychologist, that we don't get effective feedback on our work as therapists. That it's our clients, when they terminate, we often don't see them again, and we don't know how they've done. We don't get feedback on our individual. Our particular behavior unless we deliberately go after it with a supervisor and really look at components. And so this is really central to what deliberate practice is about. And it has both an evaluative information about discrepancies between desired and current performance, and then some information about where you're headed. So, I mean, this is all familiar to you. I don't need to belabor that. There are challenges, though, to people seeking out feedback. I think, there's the issue. I think there's several issues with feedback. One is, first of all, there's data in supervision, several naturalistic studies. Derek Milne in England did a study. Mickey Friedlander did another. Both were naturalistic studies looking at instances of feedback and supervision. Both found it was actually much less frequent than what the supervisors believed they were doing. And so there's the actual frequency with which we give it. Another is a motivation for it, that there's the Wallfish study, which was really alluded to in our little allegory about Hecate. That when therapists were asked to estimate their skills compared to other clinicians, none were below the 50th percentile. The average estimate of how well they were doing was at the 80th percentile. So we tend to estimate ourselves as being more effective than we actually are. I mean, statistically, it's impossible for all of us to be at the 80th percentile. And I will say, when I give workshops, in person or more extended time than we have today, I usually embed a question about that and keep replicating it, including with I'm doing a lot of work now in China with training therapists there. I think that the Chinese as a group tend to be a little more modest, but I still get the same results. So it's just human tendency to overestimate how well we're doing. And I would maintain that that has, first of all, in part, that's because we don't get feedback on how well we're doing. And second of all, I think it has a motivational feature, which is if we believe we're doing well, we tend not to seek the feedback. There's more evidence that therapists aren't good judges of how well the clients are doing. I'm aware of time. I'm going to move along here. And feedback, though, depends on the quality of information we have about what our supervisees are doing. And self-report is by far the most frequent way that we get that information, so that our supervisees come in and tell us what they did. There are a couple of problems with that. One is, even if they intend to be completely truthful, and most do for much of the time, it's simply impossible to capture all the complexities that happen in a therapeutic interaction. As well, they often don't know what's important to have reported. They, including myself, we tend to be selective in what we remember and so on. So that's on the intentional report level. And then there have been any number of studies showing that supervisees also withhold information from their supervisors. That's a given that all supervisees do, and for a host of reasons, including impression management and so on. So self-report, it's important. It gives you an opportunity and we're all doing it, as I indicated. It's by far the most frequent method we use in supervision. It allows supervisees to be reflective about their work. What it doesn't allow by itself is really that kind of fine-grained feedback on what they're doing. Better is that at least some direct observation of sessions occurs. This was, and I think in most supervision guidelines anymore, that's embedded, that the recommendation is there that this is a standard of practice. That was, Rita mentioned that I was on the task group that developed the guidelines for APA, that those are in those guidelines, that at least some of your work with your supervisees is directly observed. The accreditation guidelines for psychologists, psychology training in the US now requires that for training and so on. So I think that's becoming standard of practice. That kind of direct observation can be through live observation, or I think better recording. And I would maintain that better in the sense that recordings allow us to do micro-analysis, to really look at micro sequences and see exactly what happened when and so on. There's a lot of literature now on using simulations and role plays. In our book, The Cycle of Excellence, we have a chapter from a medical educator talking about the use of simulations in that context as a way to standardize experiences for our supervisees to see how they're going to respond to them. And of course, many of us use role plays as kind of a spontaneous way of doing a simulation within session. It gives us an opportunity to see how a supervisee is going to respond and to practice that. And finally, and I've already alluded to this, I would maintain that getting client feedback is an essential way of getting information. Client, and again, the grandparent of all of those was the Outcome Questionnaire 45, the OQ 45 that Mike Lambert developed. And since then, there's been a proliferation of those measures. I'm going to give a particular plug to Scott Miller's PCOM system, which is very simple, but the outcome rating scale is simply 4 items that the client can fill out. It takes no time at all. and the session rating scale, which is a measure of alliance, which also is four items. And so with that kind of data, you can track client progress so that, so you can see here the bottom line is the ORS from the PCOM system showing client progress, where higher scores means higher interpersonal and personal functioning for the client. The upper line is the SRS, which is a measure of alliance. And I think kind of going hand in hand with the emphasis on deliberate practice is using actual data to track how well you're doing. Again, back to the compelling evidence that, first of all, we tend not to get better as a group, and I'm sure that we're the exceptions. I'm sure all of us are getting better, but most therapists don't, and most therapists don't get feedback on how they're doing, and this is really, I think, a key to improving. Now, the caveat is that these data don't tell us what's happening in sessions. It's only an early indicator that we should pay attention. So if we track a client across time and that client's deteriorating, I think that's the point at which the supervisor and the supervisee pull out a recording of a session and really analyze what seems to be happening, and then design interventions to improve. Here's from a study, an article by Swift et al. Showing another use for outcome measurement, showing how you could, with a trainee, if you keep track of scores, you can chunk it by race, ethnicity, age, any number of dimensions, and see if there are particular patterns in that trainee's work that, are they, is this trainee better with women than men? If so, what's that about? How do you, what interventions do you use, and so on? So, and then the next component is successive refinement and repetition. That that what deliberate practice is about is practicing over and over again a skill till you master it, and then challenging yourself and moving to the next. This is a rating form, and I'll give you the link to how you can get this. This is on Tony Rumanier's website. That Tony and his team are using when they do deliberate practice, so that after each practice, the supervisee or trainee is asked to rate how easy or how hard it was, with the idea that that deliberate practice activities should stretch a person. They should be challenged, but it should be neither too easy or too hard. And then finally, and this kind of returns to the point I made earlier, that it's not practice in the day-to-day work we do, but isolating practice and doing outside of our work setting. And so it's solo practice outside of performance, and I think, and I'll get to some of the challenges about deliberate practice later, one of the big ones being that we're all busy people. How do we set aside time to do this? How do our work settings support it, and so on? So that's clearly one of the challenges to more universal adoption of deliberate practice. There's Daryl Chow, I've got a link to the site here, uses the metaphor of being on stage. Being on stage is what we do in our day-to-day work with our clients. So we're on stage. Backstage is where we're prepping for a session, that he's kind of reading over the case notes ahead of time, maybe mentally rehearsing what we did, what we're going to do, and so on. And then off stage is what we do separate from the sessions, and this could be practice sessions during the week and so on. And Daryl's metaphor for what deliberate practice is really the backstage, and especially the offstage portions. That and I've got a quote from him here: "We need to distinguish between the work we do and the work that gets us better at what we do." And then just a couple of, I think, dramatic examples, if you will, of offstage practice. World-renowned cellist Pablo Casals continued to practice 5 to 6 hours a day well into his 80s because, as he once stated, "I think I'm making progress." Michael Jordan was a basketball player here in the States, shot at least 500 free throws every day of his basketball career. So this is just plain hard work, and it's separate from performance. And so I think we're challenged in positive ways to do this, but of course then there's the challenges of how we do it and find time in our day-to-day work. So what I've done at this point is established the kind of the background of how we as a field got to be thinking about deliberate practice. I've reviewed very quickly what deliberate practice is. And then I want to talk about what we can deliberately practice. And so, I've made the distinction between competence and expertise. And let me revisit one more time the movement toward deliberate practice evolved from our quest for expertise, the quest to make the field better, one therapist at a time. So how do we really develop that expertise? So that's really where it developed. But I'm going to, as I'll show you, there's increasing movement toward using deliberate practice to develop competence. So competence is about normative goals. What should we all know what to do? How do we get better at things that we should all be competent in, as opposed to developing expertise, which is very personalized, helping the person isolate skills that they need to be developing. So I'm going to talk about four ways we can be deliberately practicing. First of those are pan-theoretical competencies. And those, these are often talked about as common factors. By the way, I want to point you toward the taxonomy of deliberate practice exercises, which Scott and Daryl have put together. I think it's if you want to use the competence framework, it's really a competence framework for common factors. And what they've done is organized it by category structure. So they've got a number of tasks under structure. So how do you start a first session? And the supervisees that go through this taxonomy is asked to estimate their skills at that. The supervisor also chimes in with their estimate of their skills, and then you can develop exercises around that. Then there's a whole host of those. How do you develop hope and expectancy? So an example is, how do you conduct an induction into therapy? And then there's a series of alliance subcategories. And of course, alliance is probably the single biggest predictor of psychotherapy outcomes. So of course, it gets a lot of attention. And you can see there's a number of specific activities or behaviors related to alliance development and maintenance. Client factors, therapy systems, and so on. So if you're interested in that taxonomy, and I would suggest you look at it, you can find it in their book, Better Results. It's in one of the appendices. Also, an earlier version used to be included in the packet that they gave when you signed up for the license for the PCOM system. The PCOM systems being the Partners in Change outcome system. The ORS and SRS, you can get a free license by going to the website here on the page, and I'll make these slides available. And it used to be that this taxonomy was embedded in that packet. And then I'm looking at that site last night and see that they're offering a deliberate practice workshop. So I just threw that in case people might be interested. So another area of pan-theoretical competencies are from Tim Anderson's work, which I think is one of the more exciting developments in the field, and I'm sure some of you have heard of it. Tim Anderson was a student of Hans Strupp, whom many of you may know of, who was at Vanderbilt University. And Strupp is famous for a study he did back in the 80s. I mean, famous for a lot of things, but one thing I've always appreciated was his study back in the 80s, where he assigned clients in an ethical way, depressed clients, to experienced clinical psychologists versus professors chosen as being especially warm. And the results of the study were that the professors were as effective as the experienced clinical psychologists, which leads us down another path that'd be fun to play out today. But it was from Strupp's work then that Tim took a next step. So what he did was develop a measure. He has a series of video clips of clients presenting difficult situations. Clips are like 3 to 5 minutes long, and it's things like where you watch the video and then formulate a response that's helpful. So one might be, why do I always have to start? Why don't you start? And the things like that. And then how do you respond? So it's a series of those clips, and they found that by scoring them on these 8 dimensions, which I'm not going to have time to get into here, but they found that that's incredibly predictive of psychotherapy outcome. So I find facilitative interpersonal skills measure as one of the more exciting developments, as I mentioned. One of the more recent studies, it's the one on the bottom of the screen, was one kind of following following his mentor's footsteps. In this case, he went onto a university campus, experienced clinical psychologists, doctoral students versus doctoral students in a number of other fields, ranging from chemistry to literature. Again, assigned them clients. And again, like his mentor, found that there wasn't any difference between the groups. Again, our sobering data. But the important part for our conversation here is what he did find was the scores on the FIS were very predictive of effectiveness, regardless whether you're a student in clinical psychology or in another field. So with that, my conversation here has been about pan-theoretical competencies we might be training for. Let me show you one instance of it. This is Bruce Wampold, who's worked with an online platform on deliberate practice. And let's see if I can click it and get it to come up. If not, I can do it another way. Yes. So did the screen follow me? Right? If not, let me know. So TheraView was designed as an online platform to provide deliberate practice opportunities, and it drew heavily on Tim Anderson's work. It's really about those pan-theoretical things. And here's Bruce describing this way of deliberate practice. So this is both about what's a deliberate practice in terms of content, but also it introduces a platform.
So Rod, we can't see the YouTube clip at the moment.
No, we're not seeing the YouTube clip there, Rod.
You're not seeing it? All right, let me try it again. Okay, share and let me.
That's it there, yeah.
Perfect.
That's perfect.
Perfect. Okay, let me go back.
The idea is
to
be able to.
Yes, we can, yeah.
To repeat the practice over and over again. Mm-hmm. And as we know from deliberate practice, if you have a coach or a supervisor or an instructor to also give you feedback, that's helpful. Okay, this is TheraView.com, and it's a platform for practicing therapy skill. The idea is you get to practice a skill multiple times, And then when you're satisfied with your response, you can submit it to the instructor or to a set of peers to get feedback. You can see various skills to practice: empathy, affective perception, alliance repair, attribution of progress, psychoeducation, and explanation. Skills that the student can practice, and the various practice cases vary on the difficulty. Here's the various practice cases in alliance repair. And you can see here there's 4 different cases. When I watch the video as the participant or the student or the therapist, and then I'm going to record a response. So I'm going to start here, and here's the practice case. Oh, and by the way, Rod, on the right are various components just to remind us, well, what makes a good alliance repair response. The instructor would teach the skill and then have the students practice. And again, they can practice on their own because, you know, the first time you do this, it doesn't sound so good. So you do it over till it's better. And then you can submit it to the instructor for feedback. Or you can submit it to some of your peers. Marcy is an 18-year-old high school student who presents with severe depression. She has conflict with both of her parents and expresses attachment difficulties. Here the therapist is inquiring about her close relationships with other students at her school.
You know, I don't really know if I'm really ready to kind of share that with you. I don't even really know you. We really just met, and I don't really think that's something I'm comfortable or ready to talk to you about.
Marcy, I really understand this. I mean, we did just meet, and I'm asking you some pretty personal questions. I really value that you're able to tell me about your uncomfortableness with this. This is going to be really important in therapy, that you do just what you did, and that is to be honest with me about your comfort in what we're doing. As we go on, it will be important to delve into some pretty personal material as part of therapy, but let's take it one step at a time. So there's my response to Marcy. If I were to do it again, Rod, I think I could do better. It was a little long-winded. I don't like to go quite that long. I made 2 or 3 points. I could be more succinct. But I did let her know that I appreciated the fact that she was honest with me. And that was the central thing I wanted to say to her. You know, when people come to therapy, they really are uncertain about what you do here. And we do ask personal questions. So Marcy's response is not out of the ordinary. But we don't like to be challenged, right? I don't want to answer your question. So then I get to rate myself, Rod. Was the response non-defensive? I think I did a pretty good job there. Does the response validate the client's concerns? Yes. Did it use one of the common rupture repair strategies? We haven't gone over those, but I'm going to say no, just for illustration. Does the response foster collaboration? I think so. But this is self-evaluation. It gets you to think about what you said in the response. Does the response consider the bond, goals, and tasks? Well, in my response, I really didn't talk about goals and tasks because we haven't got that far in therapy, but it did address the bond. Well, suppose, you know, I did this. Okay, it's late at night. I'm tired of practicing. I'm going to submit this response to my instructor. Oh, it won't let me do it because I haven't checked that I have all the necessary components. Because we really want students to think about do this again. The whole idea is that we got to get in the mindset that
What? So. What?
Thinking about going solar for your home?
Advert. Not okay.
Uh,
You got it there, Rod? Yeah.
Let me. There we go. Find my way back to the presentation. Ah. Stop. All right. Apologies. So,
Yeah, we're back to presentation. That's it. Yeah.
okay, good. Okay.
Oop, you just stopped sharing there again.
Yeah, inadvertently. I'm sorry. As many times as I use Zoom, there's still these glitches. I apologize. So I was talking, the theme has to do with what we can deliberately practice. So that was, so pan-theoretical competencies are one category, and that was one example from the work that Bruce is doing through TheraView. The next category is model-specific competencies. And so, Bruce was talking about often working with students. Well, clearly to me, experienced practitioners could use that platform and buff up their own skills, but it was primarily for students. Another, and again, it's about competencies. And so another category, though, would be model-specific competencies, which could be either for students who are still learning therapy and want to focus on particular models, or it could be for more experienced therapists who would like to delve into a different model than they've been using. And so there's a book series that Tony Rumanier is editing for APA. The first two of those books are out, one on emotion-focused therapy, another on CBT. They've got others planned on psychodynamic and multicultural and so on. Let me show another clip which illustrates how deliberate practice might look there. I'm going to come out to this again, share screen, share sound. Let's see. Okay, now we'll do it this way. Share. Okay. So we'll watch about 10 minutes of this. This is teaching a model.
And this is based on a recently published book that has just come out called Deliberate Practice in Emotion-Focused Therapy. And that's written by myself and Alex, Tony Roseman. Yeah. So today, Megan Ansley and Zoe Goldstein are going to help us to demonstrate how you do deliberate practice in emotion-focused therapy. And we're going to zero in on one particular skill, which is the empathic affirmation and validation skill. So the empathic affirmation and validation skill is one where the therapist offers the client a high degree of affirmation and validation, as it sounds, and basically communicates through their words that this is very understandable and that the therapist is there to support the client in this moment. And this is what we would do if we were doing this deliberate practice, is we'd make sure to highlight the skill criteria. So let me just say what they are. So first of all, therapist responses capture the depth and intensity of present experiencing of client. Therapist responses deepen and affirm, but do not speculate or push beyond client current experiencing, which is different than some of the other empathic responses. And therapist makes sure to use a soft, gentle, but affirming voice.
I would just highlight that the skill criteria are really the observable aspects we're wanting to get repeated practice during this exercise. So they're really the clues to guide you towards where you're trying to get at with the practice.
Okay, so now we're going to have, Zoe's going to play the client, and she's going to offer
and just very
prompt.
quickly, what they've done in the book and all the books in the series is come up with, so for each of the competencies that they teach, they have a number of prompts that the client, in quotes, can use, and and they're graded from ones that are likely to be very difficult to respond to those that are much easier, and so you'll see that.
Or a statement as a client might, and Megan is going to demonstrate offering an empathic affirmation. Okay, so when you guys are ready, I think you have the prompt, so go ahead, Zoe, you start.
I just can't believe the direction our country is taking right now. Watching the news makes me so angry.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really upsetting for you. Everything that's happening right now, it's really upsetting for you.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to actually ask you to just do that. Try it again. Same thing, try it again. And Megan, you can improvise as you see fit, right?
Okay.
So.
I just can't believe the direction our country is taking right now. Watching the news makes me so angry.
Yeah, I hear that you're feeling really angry, and there's just so much that's happening for you right now.
Okay. All right, good. How did that feel? Megan, how did that feel for you?
I feel like the second time I understood a bit more that feeling of anger. I think seeing it again and like kind of channeling into that piece of that upsetness for Zoe helped doing it the second time. Okay.
So you feel like you were able to sort of almost like be more present the second time with the emotional tone behind what she was saying?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay. Yeah, because I agree. I mean, I think the first time was a little bit more kind of rote, and then like the second time had more of you behind it, more of your presence, and your voice softened a little bit and slowed down a little bit too. So that's really good. All right, so let's try.
Okay, so again, going through my list of things you can deliberately practice, one are pan-theoretical competencies. Next were model-specific competencies. That was just a very short example from emotion-focused therapy. And this really gets us more to development of potentially expertise, because this is about individually targeted skills. And I think this is how those of you who are doing supervision are much more likely to be using this. That again, teaching competencies, there's a specific competency that everyone you would hope would be learning. In this case, you're fine-tuning it so it's specific to the needs of the trainee. And so often, and I would make the case for using routine outcome monitoring, regularly noticing a client's deteriorating or not going as expected, or maybe doing exceptionally well. You want to figure that out as well. And watching videos and determining things to practice, or it could simply be something your supervisee brings in. We don't have time to play it now, but a few years ago, one of my master's students was struggling with, she's just a brand new student, was struggling with a client who was a little bit older than her, kind of intimidated her, and just was not at all emotionally expressive. And so I arranged a consultation with Tony Rumanier, who did a deliberate practice intervention with her, which involved Tony watching the parts of the video with her, identifying what was challenging to her, and then Tony scripted her. They went through, and Tony's observation as well. It sounded like one thing you're struggling with is how to get her to express emotional affect. So let's try a phrase and see if it works for you. So they actually worked back and forth to get the phrase right. I think it was something like, is it uncomfortable for you to show your painful feelings? And again, Tony did it back and forth so that it felt right to the student, that that's something she would like to have been able to say. And then what Tony did was have her play the video, stop it periodically, and just say that phrase, and play it again and say that phrase. And after each time, Tony would check in. How did it feel? What were you thinking? What was, and let's do it again. And so again, the notion of a deliberate practice is that as she was doing it, it would become much more automatic, so that the next time she saw that client, if she chose to use that phrase, and she may or may not, given what the client presents in that session, it would be part of her repertoire. And so, so that's an example of individually targeting skills. And then the other thing about deliberate practice, I think we're going to have time to do this and do some wrap up, is that it's not just about technical and relational skills. It also can be about your own your inner skills, is what Tony calls them, or reactivity. And so if you have a particular client who's eliciting some strong feelings or countertransference, you can design a deliberate practice intervention for that. And so let me show you, this is not in response to a particular client, but it illustrates the concept. Let me again stop sharing and then do this. Oh, come on. Patrick, do you have it handy there?
Is this the video from isn't a YouTube video? It's a different one, or is it?
Yeah, that's the one I put on our shared site.
Okay, I can get it.
It's showing on the screen now.
That's coming up. DP for inner skills, yeah.
Perfect. That's okay.
It's on my screen.
Yes,
I can see that.
Hi, my name is.
Is the sound coming through?
Tony Rumanier. I'm a clinical psychologist and clinical faculty at the University of Washington. Welcome to my series of deliberate practice exercises for therapists. The goal of these exercises are to help you develop the psychological and emotional capacity to do the hard work of becoming a truly effective therapist.
So that's an example of an exercise to work on what Tony talks about, the inner skills. And again, he used a movie clip. And as I mentioned earlier, and as he mentioned, if you had a supervisee, you could take an evocative moment from a therapy session and do, if the supervisee's having a particularly difficult time with that client, to go to rewatch it and be attuned to, again, as Tony's talking about, their thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations, and so on, so that it becomes, again, a different kind of deliberate practice exercise. And I will add that Tony and his team have put together a series of stimulus videos, and I've got the link here. I'll share the slides, of course, to their website. They've got stimulus videos for an anxious woman and a woman who's had experienced sexual abuse and is recounting that, and so on. But videos that a person could to practice both inner skills and empathic skills and so on. And so then, as we kind of hit the finish line here, I want to talk about, first of all, I think some of the challenges and criticisms that that deliberate practice has. Again, to go back to the beginning, what I wanted to do today was to take stock of the fact that deliberate practice has been around long enough now that we can kind of see where it's going and what it's encountering. I think one issue for us as supervisors is that we already have plenty to do in our sessions, and we scant time to get through it all anyway. And so how do you find time to build in one additional thing with the deliberate practice? And Tony and I've talked about this, and his suggestion is to deliberately, if you will, build in a part of the session toward the middle, not the beginning or end, in which you really do focus on a specific skill and give maybe 10 minutes to it, then with homework to the supervisee. But I do think that's an ongoing issue. And then the other one, kind of similar, is where practitioners are going to find the additional time to do this. We're busy people. How do we find that added time? And I think, one answer could be that, like the Calgary Counseling Center, which is committed to this sort of work, that they built it in as part of their structure. Deliberate practice has been criticized as a reductionistic approach, and of course it is. It's really about isolating a specific skill, but then to reintegrate it into a larger pattern. So it is reductionistic, but then, if it's not reintegrated into a larger pattern of behavior, it's not going to be of any use. Another criticism is that it's about skills, whether they're inner skills that Tony talks about or technical or relational skills, but there's not much emphasis on when to apply them and how to use them. And I think that's absolutely true. And I think that's where we come to play as supervisors, that we help them with that. And one other criticism is that deliberate practice isn't new in training. And I think, some of us will remember the work, micro skills training by Alan Ivey, Kharkov and Truax's work, and don't have time to get into the history of all that, but here's an example. Just very quickly, Truax and Kharkov both worked with Carl Rogers and operationalized his constructs, and back in the 70s or late 60s even, and came up with rating scales so you could teach empathic responding, for example. And I've got on the screen here their rating scales, a 5-point rating scale, and so on. And I think one way that deliberate practice is different is that I've used this Kharkov's model for many decades now in my teaching, but what I've typically done is a role play, having students, I don't carefully control the responding, is that pair students up and have them practice responding to each other, but I don't control the input, much like the example you saw with emotion-focused therapy. And also students tend to bring in other factors, so it's not just purely empathic responding, but then other skills. And also this is a rating scale as opposed to, if you saw the examples, they tend to be much simpler and more checklisty, so that it's easier to focus on specific behaviors. And then finally, what I'm going to predict is that deliberate practice is going to become embedded in training going forward. I think it's going to be something we'll see in graduate programs, people teaching new models. I think some few therapists will use it in the way that it was originally intended as expertise development. But I think for that to happen, is, like I said, the agencies are going to have to create a structure, and the therapists and supervisors involved are going to have a motivational set to do that. And by the way, just a quick last thought, which is one thing we don't have in the States, which I know is true in Ireland and the UK and so on, is career-long supervision. And it seems to me that deliberate practice would be a unique opportunity to, there's a context in which deliberate practice might be applied in ways that we don't have that opportunity in the US. And so with that, I will wrap up. So thank you for attentiveness, and I'm sorry we didn't have time for discussion. There was a lot to get through.
Thank you very much indeed, Rod, for your very informative keynote speech. I think really motivating us to engage in deliberate practice going forward. So thank you so much indeed. And some lovely comments there coming in the chat box about your presentation today. So thank you very much indeed. Absolutely wonderful.